A widowed cowboy stood at the edge of his burned-out ranch, staring at the charred remains of everything he'd built with his bare hands. The woman who approached him through the smoke-stained morning mist looked like she hadn't eaten in days, her dress patched with scraps of different fabric, her shoes held together with string and stubborn hope. She had no business offering advice to a man who'd lost everything, but sometimes the most broken people see the clearest path forward. What happened next would change both their lives forever, but not in the way either of them expected. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly in every direction, a canvas of rolling hills and stubborn grass that refused to surrender to the harsh winters. It was 1882, and the land still held secrets, still demanded blood and sweat from anyone foolish enough to call it home. This was a place where dreams came to die, where the wind carried the whispers of those who'd tried and failed before. But it was also a place where the most unlikely redemption stories began. Thomas Garrett had been standing in the same spot for 3 hours, watching the last wisps of smoke rise from what used to be his barn. The fire had taken everything: his livestock, his tools, his grain stores, even the old leather saddle his father had given him before heading west 20 years ago. The flames had been merciless, consuming not just wood and hay, but the future he'd planned with careful precision. His wife Sarah had been gone 2 winters now, claimed by the fever that swept through the territory like a thief in the night. The ranch had been their dream, their shared vision of something permanent in a world that seemed determined to keep moving. Without her, the daily routine had become a ritual of remembrance, each chore a prayer to her memory. Now even that was gone. The woman approached slowly, her footsteps careful on the uneven ground. She moved like someone who understood that sudden movements could shatter whatever fragile piece a person had managed to construct. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, streaked with premature grey that spoke of hardships endured without complaint. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned to find strength in the smallest victories. "Mister," she said, her voice carrying the soft accent of the Deep South, "I know it ain't my place to say, but standing here won't bring none of it back." Thomas turned slowly, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke and sleepless nights. He'd been drinking since dawn, not enough to forget, but enough to dull the sharp edges of his grief. The bottle sat empty beside his boots, catching the morning light like a prism of broken promises. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough as gravel, "I appreciate your concern, but I reckon I know what's gone and what ain't." She nodded, understanding flickering in her dark eyes. "I'm sure you do, but sometimes knowing and accepting are 2 different animals entirely." He studied her face, taking in the lines around her eyes, the way her hands rested calmly at her sides despite the obvious poverty of her circumstances. There was something about her presence that demanded attention, not through force or volume, but through the quiet certainty of someone who'd walked through fire and emerged with wisdom instead of bitterness. "Name's Thomas Garrett," he said finally. "This was my ranch, was my life, I suppose." "Martha Caldwell," she replied with a slight nod. "And I'm sorry for your loss, all of it." The way she said it, with such simple conviction, made something crack open in his chest. She wasn't offering empty platitudes or hollow comfort. She was acknowledging the full weight of what he'd lost, giving it the respect it deserved. "You passing through?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Was," she said, "but my wagon broke down about 2 miles back, lost a wheel on the rocky stretch near Devil's Canyon. My horse took off when a rattler spooked him, and I ain't seen him since." Thomas felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in months. Responsibility, purpose, the instinct to help someone in need, even when he could barely help himself. "You walking then?" "I ain't been walking since yesterday morning." She glanced at the smoking ruins behind him, saw the smoke from the ridge, thought maybe someone might have food to spare, or at least directions to the nearest town. The irony wasn't lost on him. She'd come seeking help from a man who had nothing left to give. But something in her manner, the way she stood without apology or shame, despite her obvious circumstances, stirred something in him that he'd thought the fire had consumed. "Nearest town is Willow Creek," he said, "about 15 miles northeast. Hard walking, especially for someone who ain't eaten recently." She smiled then, expression that transformed her entire face. "I've done harder things than walk 15 miles, Mr. Garrett, but I thank you for the direction." She turned to go, but Thomas found himself speaking before his mind could catch up with his mouth. "Wait." She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "I got coffee," he said. "Pot's still warm from this morning, and there's some jerky in my saddlebags. Ain't much, but it's something." Martha studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing whether accepting his offer would somehow diminish them both. Finally she nodded. "That's kindness I won't forget, Mr. Garrett." They walked toward the small cabin that had somehow survived the fire, its log walls scarred but standing. Thomas had built it with his own hands, cutting each log, fitting each stone in the foundation. It was modest, functional, designed for two people who valued substance over style. Inside, the space felt hollow without Sarah's presence. Her sewing basket still sat beside the window. Her apron still hung on the hook by the door. Thomas had left everything exactly as she'd arranged it, unable to bear the thought of changing anything that might hold her memory. Martha didn't comment on the obvious signs of a woman's touch, didn't ask about the second chair at the table or the delicate curtains that framed the windows. She simply accepted his offer of coffee with the same quiet grace she'd shown outside. "This is good coffee," she said after the first sip. "Been a while since I've had any this strong." "Sarah always said I made it too strong," Thomas replied, then stopped abruptly. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in months. "Sarah was your wife," Martha said gently. It wasn't a question. He nodded, not trusting his voice. "She had good taste in men," Martha continued. "Takes a special kind of person to offer coffee to a stranger when they're standing in the ashes of their own dreams." Thomas felt that crack in his chest widened slightly. "Dreams," he repeated. "Funny word for it. Feels more like foolishness now." Martha set down her cup and looked at him directly. "Mr. Garrett, can I tell you something?" He gestured for her to continue. "I've been walking this territory for 3 weeks now. Left everything I owned back in Kansas when my husband died and the bank took our farm. I've slept under bridges, eaten berries when I could find them, and asked for help from more people than I care to count." She paused, her eyes never leaving his. "Most folks look at me and see a burden, someone to be pitied or avoided, but you looked at me and saw a person who needed help." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Ain't nothing special about that." "Isn't it?" Martha asked. "When's the last time someone showed you that kind of consideration?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't remember. Since Sarah's death, he'd been so focused on keeping the ranch running, on maintaining the routine that kept his grief at bay, that he'd barely spoken to another human being. The neighboring ranchers had offered help initially, but his stubborn pride had driven them away. He'd convinced himself he needed to carry the burden alone. "I don't know," he admitted. "That's what I thought." Martha reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "You're not too far gone, Mr. Garrett, not by a long shot." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tight knot of despair that had been his constant companion. For the first time since the fire, he felt the possibility of something beyond mere survival. "What makes you so sure?" he asked. Martha smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. "Because you're still here, still standing, still offering coffee to strangers. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending the remaining smoke from the barn swirling across the yard. The sound reminded Thomas of all he'd lost, but for the first time, it also reminded him of all he might still have to gain. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Before your wagon broke down, I mean." "Oregon Territory," Martha replied. "Got a sister there who says there's work for anyone willing to do it. Figured I'd try my luck starting over." Thomas nodded slowly. Starting over. The concept had seemed impossible just hours ago. But sitting across from this woman who'd lost everything and still found reasons to smile, it began to feel like something more than just a dream. "Long way to Oregon," he said. "Yes, it is." Martha finished her coffee and stood. "But I reckon every journey starts with a single step, and I've already taken quite a few of those." She moved toward the door, but Thomas found himself reluctant to let her go. Her presence had awakened something in him, a reminder of what it felt like to share space with another human being, to feel connected to something beyond his own grief. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said as she reached for the door handle. "It's Miss," she corrected gently. "Never had the chance to be a Mrs." The admission surprised him. She carried herself with such quiet authority that he'd assumed she'd been married, had built a life with someone before circumstances forced her onto the road. "Miss Caldwell," he continued, "that 15 miles to Willow Creek. It's rough country, not safe for a woman traveling alone." She turned back to face him, one eyebrow raised slightly. "Are you offering to escort me, Mr. Garrett?" The question caught him off guard. Was he? The thought hadn't fully formed in his mind, but as soon as she spoke it aloud, he realized that yes, he was. "I might be," he said slowly. "Got nothing keeping me here anymore." Martha studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read the truth behind words. The offer hung between them like morning mist, fragile and uncertain. She'd been walking alone for so long that the prospect of companionship felt both thrilling and terrifying. "Mr. Garrett," she said carefully, "I appreciate the kindness, but I won't be anyone's burden. I've made it this far on my own, and I can make it the rest of the way. Thomas stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of standing in the same position. Didn't say you were a burden, said the country was dangerous. There's a difference. Something in his tone made her pause. It wasn't pity she heard, or the condescending concern of a man who thought women were helpless creatures. It was the practical assessment of someone who knew the territory, who understood its hidden dangers. What kind of dangerous, she asked. Bandits, mostly. Group of them been working the road between here and Willow Creek for the past month. They got a taste for robbing travelers, especially those who look like they might be carrying something valuable. He gestured toward her patched dress. They ain't particular about who they rob, but they're especially fond of folks traveling alone. Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She'd heard rumors in the last town, whispers about missing travelers and abandoned wagons found stripped bare. She'd hoped they were just stories, the kind of tales that grew larger with each telling. You seen them, she asked. Tracks mostly, but Sheriff Morrison in Willow Creek sent word last week. 3 men, well armed, operating out of the old mining camp near Copper Falls. They know the country better than most, and they ain't shy about using their guns. The weight of this information settled on Martha's shoulders like a heavy cloak. 15 miles had seemed manageable when it was just distance and weather to contend with. Adding armed men to the equation changed everything. So what are you proposing? She asked. Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the charred remains of his dreams. I got a horse, strong enough to carry 2 people, at least partway. We could make better time together, and there's safety in numbers. And what do you get out of it? The question seemed to surprise him. He turned back to face her, his expression thoughtful. Honest answer. I don't know. Maybe just the chance to do something useful, instead of standing here feeling sorry for myself. Martha appreciated the honesty. Too many men would have dressed up their motivations in noble language, made themselves sound like heroes rescuing damsels in distress. Thomas was offering something simpler and more genuine, mutual benefit between 2 people who'd found themselves in difficult circumstances. I don't have money to pay you, she said. Didn't ask for any. And when we reach Willow Creek, then we part ways, Thomas said simply. You continue on to Oregon, and I figure out what comes next. The uncertainty in his voice touched something deep in Martha's chest. She recognized the look in his eyes, the expression of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or step back. She'd worn that same expression when she'd left Kansas, when she'd made the decision to walk away from everything familiar and strike out into the unknown. All right, she said finally, but I pull my own weight. I can cook, I can tend to injuries, and I've got a good eye for trouble. I won't be dead weight on your horse. Thomas nodded, something like relief flickering across his features. Fair enough. We'll leave at first light tomorrow. That'll give us time to prepare, and it's safer to travel in daylight anyway. Where will I sleep tonight? The question hung in the air with unexpected weight. Thomas glanced around the cabin, suddenly aware of how small it was, how intimate the space felt with another person in it. He'd grown accustomed to the hollow silence, to the way his footsteps echoed in the emptiness. Adding another presence changed everything. There's a bed in the loft, he said. Sarah used to. It's clean, hasn't been used since she passed. Martha heard the catch in his voice when he mentioned his wife, saw the way his hands tightened slightly at his sides. She understood grief, knew how it could ambush a person at the most unexpected moments. I'm grateful for the shelter, she said gently, and I'm sorry about your wife. Losing someone you love, it changes the shape of everything. Thomas looked at her sharply. You speak like you know. I do. Martha sat back down at the table, her hands wrapped around the empty coffee cup. Had a man once. We weren't married, but we planned to be. He was a carpenter, good with his hands, gentle with everything he touched, including me. She paused, her eyes distant with memory. Fever took him too. Same winter it took half the county. I watched him waste away, watched him fight for every breath, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to help. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. Here was someone who understood the particular weight of watching death, claim someone you loved, the helplessness that came with knowing all your strength and determination meant nothing against the inevitable. How long? He asked. 3 years last month. Still wake up sometimes expecting to find him beside me. She looked up at Thomas. Does it get easier? The question was asked with such simple directness that it caught him off guard. Most people avoided asking about grief, as if speaking about it might somehow make it contagious. But Martha asked like someone who genuinely wanted to know, who was willing to hear whatever truth he might offer. No, he said finally, but it changes. The sharp edges wear down some, You learn to carry it different. Martha nodded as if this made perfect sense. I figured as much. People keep telling me time heals all wounds, but that never felt right to me. Some wounds aren't meant to heal completely. They're meant to remind us of what mattered. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Thomas found himself studying Martha's face in the golden light, noticing details he'd missed before. The way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled, the small scar on her chin that spoke of some long-ago accident, the steady way she breathed as if she'd made peace with whatever life had thrown at her. "I'll get us some supplies together," he said, standing abruptly. "We'll need food for the journey, and I want to check my rifle, make sure it's clean and loaded." Martha rose as well. "I can help with the food. I'm handy with preserving meat, and I know which plants are safe to eat if we run short." They worked together through the afternoon, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. Thomas cleaned his weapons while Martha sorted through his meager food supplies, creating meals that would travel well and provide sustenance for the journey ahead. She moved through his kitchen with quiet efficiency, respecting the space while making herself useful. As evening approached, Thomas found himself reluctant to see the day end. For the first time since Sarah's death, the cabin felt alive again, not in the same way it had when his wife was there, but in a new way that spoke of possibility rather than memory. "Martha," he said as they prepared a simple supper of beans and salt pork. "Yes. Thank you for agreeing to this, for bringing something back to life in this place." She paused in her stirring, considering his words. "Mr. Garrett, I think we're both bringing something back to life. Question is, what are we going to do with it once we find it?" The question lingered between them as they ate their meal in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts of the journey ahead and the uncertain futures that awaited them both. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new possibilities. But tonight, for the first time in longer than either cared to remember, neither of them felt completely alone. The morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Thomas had spent the night listening to the soft sounds of another person breathing in his house, the gentle creaks of footsteps on the loft floor, the whispered movements of someone trying not to disturb his rest. It was a symphony he'd forgotten existed, one that reminded him of what it meant to share space with another living soul. Martha descended the ladder, just as the first pale light began to seep through the windows. She moved quietly, her hair already braided, and her few possessions bundled in a cloth sack that looked like it had seen better decades. There was something about her morning efficiency that spoke of a woman who'd learned to make the most of whatever circumstances found her. "Coffee's ready," Thomas said, gesturing toward the pot on the stove. "And I found some hardtack that should travel well." She accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warmth. "You sleep at all?" "Some." He didn't mention that he'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was making a mistake. Not about helping her, that felt right in a way he couldn't explain, but about leaving this place, about walking away from the only life he'd ever known. "Second thoughts?" she asked, as if reading his mind. Thomas looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the details he'd memorized without meaning to. The way the morning light hit the table where he and Sarah had shared 1,000 meals. The chair where she'd sat mending clothes while he read aloud from whatever book they'd managed to acquire. The doorframe where they'd stood embracing on the morning before she took ill. "Every damn one of them," he admitted. "But I reckon second thoughts are just fear dressed up in fancy clothes." Martha smiled at that, the expression transforming her face from merely pleasant to something approaching beautiful. "My grandmother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs doing despite the fear." Smart woman. She was. Lived through the war, raised 6 children on her own when Grandpa died, and never once complained about the hand life dealt her. Martha finished her coffee and set the cup down with finality. "She would have liked you, I think." Thomas felt something warm spread through his chest at the compliment. It had been so long since anyone had spoken well of him, since anyone had seen past his grief to whatever man might still exist underneath. They finished their preparations in companionable silence. Thomas saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, who'd been his companion for the better part of 5 years. The animal seemed to sense the significance of the moment, pawing the ground with unusual energy. "He's eager," Martha observed, running her hand along Buck's neck. "Hasn't been anywhere in months," Thomas replied. "Probably thinks we're just going to check the fence line." But as they led the horse away from the cabin, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Buck understood more than he was letting on. The animal kept looking back toward the burned barn, then forward toward the open country ahead, as if weighing the past against the future. The first mile passed in relative quiet. Martha walked beside the horse while Thomas rode, both of them adjusting to the rhythm of travel after months of staying in one place. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and distant snow from the mountains. It was the kind of day that made a person believe in possibilities. "Tell me about Oregon," Thomas said as they crested a small hill. "Your sister, I mean." Martha's expression softened. "Rebecca. She's 3 years younger than me, but twice as brave. Married a man who had dreams of starting a timber business out west. They left Kansas right after the war, when everyone was talking about new opportunities in the territories." "You miss her?" "Every day. We wrote letters for a while, but mail service out here is unpredictable at best. Last I heard, they'd settled near a town called Portland. She said there was work for anyone willing to do it, and plenty of land for those who wanted to make a fresh start." Thomas nodded, understanding the appeal. The idea of starting over, of building something new from nothing, had been what drew him and Sarah to Montana in the first place. But that was before he'd learned how quickly dreams could turn to ash. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Anything that needs doing, cooking, cleaning, tending to children." Rebecca said there are more opportunities for women out there than back east. Less concern about what's proper and more focus on what's practical. There was something in her voice, a note of longing, that made Thomas glance down at her. "You sound like you're looking forward to it." "I am, but I'm also scared." Martha kicked at a loose stone in the path. "It's been so long since I've had a real home, a place where I belonged. Sometimes I wonder if I've forgotten how to be part of something bigger than just surviving." Thomas understood that fear intimately. Since Sarah's death, he'd existed in a kind of limbo, going through the motions of living without really participating in life. The idea of connecting with other people, of building relationships that might matter, felt both necessary and terrifying. "Maybe that's something you learn by doing," he said, "like riding a horse. You don't remember how until you're back in the saddle." Martha looked up at him with something like surprise. That's surprisingly wise for a man who's spent the last 2 years talking to cows. Thomas laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. "The cows are good listeners. They don't interrupt and they don't judge." Unlike people, he agreed. They were approaching a narrow pass between 2 rocky outcroppings when Thomas held up his hand for silence. Something had caught his attention, a sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the country. He dismounted quickly, motioning for Martha to move behind the horse. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders, coming up the back trail." Thomas pulled his rifle from its scabbard, checking the action with practiced efficiency. "Could be nothing, but I'd rather be ready." The sound grew clearer as they waited, the steady clip-clop of multiple horses moving at a deliberate pace. Thomas counted 3 distinct sets of hoofbeats, which matched the description Sheriff Morrison had given him of the bandits operating in the area. "Can we go around?" Martha asked. Thomas studied the terrain, weighing their options. The pass was the quickest route to Willow Creek, but it was also a natural bottleneck. If the riders were hostile, they'd be trapped with nowhere to run. On the other hand, detouring around the rocky ground would add hours to their journey and put them on more exposed ground. "Not without losing half the day," he said, "and there's no guarantee we won't run into them anyway." The riders appeared around the bend, 3 men on horseback moving with the casual confidence of people who owned whatever territory they happened to be crossing. Thomas felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the type: hard faces, weapons worn easy on their hips, eyes that measured everything in terms of profit and loss. The leader was a tall man with graying hair and a beard that looked like it had been trimmed with a knife. He wore a black hat and a coat that had seen better years, but his horse was well cared for and his saddle was good leather. The kind of man who invested in the tools of his trade. "Morning," the leader called out as they approached. "Fine day for traveling." "Morning," Thomas replied, keeping his rifle visible but not directly threatening. "Indeed it is." The 3 riders stopped about 20 feet away, close enough to talk but far enough to make any sudden moves difficult. Thomas noticed they'd positioned themselves to block the pass, whether intentionally or not. "Name's Cordell," the leader said. "These are my associates, Mr. Pike and Mr. Stevens. We're conducting business in the area." "What kind of business?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew. Cordell smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "The kind that requires us to ensure safe passage for travelers. Dangerous country out here, lot of unsavory characters about." Martha stepped slightly forward, her chin raised in a way that suggested she wasn't intimidated by men who made their living through intimidation. "How thoughtful of you to be concerned for our safety." "Pike," A younger man with nervous energy and quick hands laughed. She's got spirit. I like that in a woman. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. The way Pike looked at Martha, the casual assumption in his voice, told him everything he needed to know about these men and their intentions. We appreciate your concern, Thomas said carefully, but we're well armed and familiar with the country. We can take care of ourselves. Can you now? Cordell's smile widened. That's admirable. But you see, we've invested considerable time and effort in making this area safe for travelers. Seems only fair that those who benefit from our protection should contribute to the cost. What kind of contribution? Martha asked, her voice steady despite the obvious threat. Oh, nothing too burdensome. Whatever supplies you can spare, maybe that fine rifle your friend is carrying, perhaps a few hours of your time to express proper gratitude for our services. The last comment was directed at Martha, and the meaning was unmistakable. Thomas felt his grip tighten on his rifle, felt the familiar weight of violence settling on his shoulders like an old coat. I'm afraid we can't spare anything, he said. We're traveling light as it is. Cordell's expression hardened. That's unfortunate. You see, we're not really asking, we're informing you of the tax required to use this road. Stevens, who had remained silent until now, spoke up.
Boss, maybe we should just take what we need and be done with it. Sun's getting high and we got other business to attend to.
Patience, Mr. Stevens. Our new friends here are still deciding whether they want to be cooperative. Thomas could feel the situation spiraling toward violence. These men had done this before, had refined their approach to extract maximum profit with minimum risk. They were confident, professional, and completely without conscience. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that Thomas was just another traveler, someone who would hand over his possessions to avoid trouble. They hadn't considered that he might be someone who'd already lost everything that mattered, someone who no longer had anything left to lose. Martha, he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Cordell, when I give the word, get behind that boulder. Thomas, no, there are 3 of them. I know, but there's only 1 of me, and I've got nothing left to lose. Cordell laughed. Listen to your woman, friend. She's got more sense than you do. The casual dismissal, the assumption that Martha was his property to be bartered or taken, was the final straw. Thomas felt something break loose inside him, something that had been building pressure since the moment he'd stood watching his dreams burn to ash. She's not my woman, he said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who'd made his decision. She's not anyone's woman. She's a person who deserves to travel this road without being threatened by pieces of human waste like you. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Cordell's smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. That's unfortunate, he said. Mr. Pike, I believe this gentleman needs a lesson in proper manners. Pike reached for his gun, but Thomas was already moving. The rifle came up smooth and fast, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might have hesitated. The shot echoed off the rocky walls like thunder, and Pike tumbled from his saddle with a cry of pain and surprise. Stevens cursed and went for his own weapon. But Martha had already moved. She'd picked up a rock the size of a man's fist and threw it with deadly accuracy, catching Stevens in the temple just as his gun cleared leather. He swayed in the saddle, dazed and bleeding. Cordell found himself facing a man with a rifle and a woman who'd just proved she wasn't helpless. The odds had shifted dramatically in a matter of seconds. Drop your gun, Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd already proven he was willing to use his weapon. Do it now. Cordell hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Pike was on the ground, clutching his shoulder and moaning. Stevens was still conscious but barely, blood streaming down his face. The easy prey had turned into something altogether more dangerous. You're making a mistake, Cordell said, but his hand moved slowly toward his gun belt. The mistake was yours, Thomas replied. You assumed we were victims. You were wrong. Cordell's gun hit the ground with a metallic clatter. Thomas kept his rifle trained on the man while Martha moved to collect the weapons from the other 2 bandits. Now what? Cordell asked, his voice tight with suppressed rage. Thomas considered the question. These men had been terrorizing travelers for months, robbing and possibly killing innocent people. Justice demanded that they be turned over to the proper authorities, but they were still 15 miles from Willow Creek, and transporting 3 prisoners would be difficult and dangerous. Now you're going to listen very carefully, Thomas said. You're going to get your friends back on their horses, and you're going to ride out of here. If I ever see you in this territory again, if I hear about you bothering travelers, I'll hunt you down and finish what we started here. Martha looked at him with surprise. Thomas, they'll just find other people to rob. Maybe, but they'll do it somewhere else, and they'll remember what happened here. Sometimes that's enough. Cordell helped Pike to his feet, the younger man still bleeding from the bullet wound in his shoulder. Stevens managed to stay in his saddle, though he looked unsteady. The three men gathered their scattered weapons under Thomas's watchful eye. "This isn't over," Cordell said as they prepared to leave. "Yes, it is," Thomas replied. "It's over because you're going to make it over. Because you understand that continuing this behavior will get you killed." The three men rode away slowly. Pike slumped over his horse's neck, Stevens swaying dangerously. Thomas kept his rifle ready until they disappeared around the bend, then finally allowed himself to relax. Martha was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You let them go." "I did. They might come back." "They might. But they won't come back here. And they won't come back today. That's enough for now." She studied his face, looking for something she wasn't sure she'd find. "You could have killed them, all of them." "I could have. But killing them wouldn't have brought back my ranch, or your wagon, or anyone else they might have hurt. It would have just made me a killer." Martha nodded slowly, understanding something about the man beside her that she hadn't seen before. He wasn't just grieving and lost. He was someone who'd held on to his principles even when life had stripped away everything else. "We should keep moving," she said, "in case they change their minds." Thomas agreed, and they continued down the trail toward Willow Creek. But something had changed between them during the confrontation. They'd faced danger together, had protected each other without hesitation. The careful politeness of strangers had been replaced by something deeper, more substantial. "Martha," Thomas said as they walked. "Yes? Thank you, for the rock, for not running when things got ugly." She smiled. "Thank you for not letting them take what wasn't theirs to take." They traveled in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about what had just happened and what it might mean for the journey ahead. The sun climbed higher, the day grew warmer, and the distance to Willow Creek grew shorter with each step. But neither of them was thinking about the town anymore. They were thinking about the fact that they'd stood together when it mattered, that they'd protected each other without question or hesitation. They were thinking about what that might mean for two people who'd both forgotten what it felt like to have someone care whether they lived or died. The road to Willow Creek stretched ahead of them, but it no longer felt like a journey towards separation. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon when they finally saw the smoke rising from Willow Creek's chimneys. The town spread before them like a promise kept, modest but substantial, with wooden buildings lining a main street that had seen enough traffic to wear deep ruts in the dirt. It wasn't much, but after the events of the morning, it looked like civilization itself. Thomas felt Buck's pace quicken beneath him, the horse sensing the nearness of hay and grain and rest. Martha had been walking for the better part of 6 hours, but her step remained steady, her back straight. She possessed the kind of endurance that came from necessity, the ability to keep moving long after comfort had become a memory. "There's the hotel," Thomas said, pointing toward a 2-story building with a painted sign that proclaimed it the Willow Creek Inn. "And the sheriff's office is just down the street." Martha nodded, but her expression had grown thoughtful as they approached the town's edge. The reality of their situation was settling in, now that their destination was within reach. They'd traveled together through necessity, protected each other through instinct, but what came next remained unspoken between them. "Thomas," she said as they reached the first buildings.
"Yes?"
"What you did back there, standing up to those men, that took more than just courage." He looked down at her, surprised by the seriousness in her voice. Seemed like the only choice to make. "Was it?" Martha stopped walking, forcing him to rein in Buck. "Because I've known plenty of men who would have made different choices, who would have handed over whatever those bandits wanted, rather than risk their lives for someone they barely knew." Thomas dismounted, suddenly uncomfortable with looking down at her from horseback. The distance felt wrong now, too formal for whatever was happening between them. "Maybe I'm just too stubborn to know when I'm beaten," he said. Martha stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to catch the scent of sage and sunshine that clung to her hair. "Or maybe you're the kind of man who remembers what it means to do right by people, even when the world's given you every reason to stop caring." The words hit him with unexpected force. For 2 years, he'd believed that grief had hollowed him out, left him empty of everything but the ability to endure. But standing here with Martha, feeling the weight of her regard, he began to understand that some things couldn't be burned away or buried under sorrow. "Martha," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I know," she said softly. "I know what you're going to say, that we had an agreement, that Willow Creek was where we'd part ways, that you'd figure out what comes next on your own." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. That was the plan. Plans change. She looked toward the town, then back at him. At least they can if both people want them to. The invitation in her words was gentle but unmistakable. She wasn't asking him to make promises he couldn't keep or commit to a future he couldn't see clearly. She was simply suggesting that they might continue forward together, at least for a while longer. "I don't know what kind of man I am anymore," Thomas said. "These past 2 years, I've been more ghost than human. Don't know if I remember how to be part of something real." Martha reached out and touched his hand, her fingers warm against his skin. "Then maybe it's time to find out." A group of children ran past them, laughing and calling to each other in the way children did when the day was fine and the world felt full of possibilities. Their voices echoed off the buildings, bright and uncomplicated, a reminder that life continued even when individual hearts forgot how to participate in its rhythms. "Your sister in Oregon," Thomas said. "She expecting you to arrive alone?" "Rebecca's expecting me to arrive alive and whole," Martha replied. "Everything else is negotiable." Thomas looked at the town spread before them, at the people moving about their daily business with the easy confidence of those who belonged somewhere. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt the pull of that belonging, the desire to be part of something larger than his own grief. "I've got some money saved," he said. "Not much, but enough to buy supplies for the road to Oregon, if you're willing to travel with a man who's still figuring out who he wants to be." Martha's smile started slowly, like sunrise breaking over distant mountains. "I think I'd like that very much." They walked into Willow Creek together, leading Buck between them. The townspeople they passed offered polite nods and curious glances, the kind of attention strangers always drew in small communities. But Thomas found he didn't mind the scrutiny. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like he had something worth being curious about. At the sheriff's office, they reported their encounter with the bandits. Sheriff Morrison, a weathered man with kind eyes and careful hands, listened to their account with the attention of someone who'd seen enough trouble to recognize the real thing when it walked through his door. "You did the right thing," he told Thomas after hearing the story. "Those men have been a plague on this territory for months. Maybe they'll think twice before trying it again." "And if they don't?" Martha asked. Morrison's expression hardened slightly. "Then next time they won't be dealing with honest travelers just trying to get by. They'll be dealing with me and a posse of men who've had enough of their particular brand of business." They spent the night at the Willow Creek Inn, in separate rooms but connected by the knowledge that everything between them had changed. Thomas lay in his bed, listening to the sounds of the town settling into evening quiet. And for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something that might have been peace. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp air that promised good traveling weather. They met in the hotel dining room, where Martha had already secured supplies for the journey west, and Thomas had arranged for Buck to be reshod and fitted with packs for the longer haul ahead. "Ready?" she asked as they prepared to leave. Thomas looked back toward the east, toward the territory that held the ashes of his old life. Then he looked west, toward Oregon and whatever future might be waiting there. "I'm ready," he said. And as they rode out of Willow Creek together, heading toward the horizon that promised new beginnings, Thomas realized that Martha had been right about one thing. He wasn't too far gone. He was just far enough gone to understand the value of what he'd found, and close enough to hope to know that some endings were really just the first chapter of something better. The road to Oregon stretched ahead of them, long and uncertain, but no longer lonely. They rode together toward whatever came next, two people who'd learned that sometimes the most broken souls could offer each other exactly what they needed to heal. If this story touched something deep in your heart, if it reminded you that even in our darkest moments we're not too far gone for redemption, then you've found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of second chances, unexpected grace, and love that blooms in the most unlikely places. Hit that bell so you never miss the next journey of hope across the frontier. Until then, remember that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings rise from the ashes of what we thought was the end.